Welcome everyone to the second day of the Africa Week 2024. And in this very first panel for the day, we are discussing climate and sustainability. As obviously you can see, we are looking at the psychology and the social dimensions of climate change governance. Global efforts to combat climate change and sustainability and assure environmental sustainability has become even more urgent due to increasing global temperature that has exceeded now 2 degrees Celsius, which is a problem, which is now above the pre-industrial levels by 2 degrees Celsius. Despite efforts in an advancement in clean energy technology and knowledge for reducing greenhouse gas emission and protecting the flora and fauna of the world, significant barriers exist, both globally and locally. Emerging evidence shows that ambitious notions of justice and ambiguous notions of justice is a major factor that perpetuates this challenge, partly because policymaking and programming on climate and energy transitions do not often carry people along. Relationship building between ordinary people, investors, policymakers, and other stakeholders suffer as a result. Yet, we all know that certain relationships, getting the relationships right is as important as getting climate right. You can't have climate without having those relationships all sorted. Now, today we have 6 scholars and practitioners who have had long years of experience delving into the complex issues of regulations, laws, the financing, geography, political economy, sociology, and environmental governance of climate and environmental sustainability. And they are here today to share their perspectives on how we can reset the relationship between all stakeholders in getting the climate and sustainability right. In the panel discussing today, I will introduce the 6 panelists in a moment. We are going to answer a fundamental question, and that broadly is, how should communities, societies, governments, and investors in the environmental sustainability and energy sectors interact to contribute sustainability and justice and equity in the transition? So effectively, we are going to they are going to share their perspectives from 2 angles. First, we will interrogate the factors that reinforce or undermine the quality of relationships at the community, national, international, corporate levels. And then secondly, we'll begin to examine how those factors have a bearing on climate action for environmental sustainability. Now, first of all, as I welcome you, please feel free to type in questions when, as people speak. And then I would try to direct the questions to the panelists to respond at the appropriate time after the first 30 minutes or so. And then feel free to request for me to unmute you to speak if you really want to speak without having to type. Now, let me, take a moment to introduce the speakers. But before I do that, obviously, we are within the Africa Week with so many events happening. Jump onto the King's website, select events, please register and attend. This is an annual event, and it's always very interactive and interesting. Now, the first speaker on my list is Veronica Nonhlaha Jakarasi. Sorry if I destroyed your name, Veronica. So Veronica, often called Ni Gundu, is a chartered development finance analyst and executive director of the Institute of Sustainability and Development Finance in Zimbabwe. She's the former head of climate finance at Africa Enterprise Challenge Fund in Kenya and has 15 years of experience in sustainability, climate finance, and diplomacy, thought leadership, financial literacy, and natural capital management. Veronica is the lead negotiator at Mitigation for the Africa Group of Negotiators under the Global Climate Negotiations, and she leads the Group of 75 in China on gender and climate change issues. Can you say hi, Veronica, so people can see you?
Hello, everyone.
Thank you. Then the next person is not in any particular order, but Dr. Justin C. He is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Sydney Environment Institute and is affiliated with the School of Geoscience at the University of Sydney. As a human geographer, his research investigates the intersecting dimensions of power, injustice, and inequality reflected in the planning and implementation of climate change adaptation projects across space, class, and time. He draws upon climate justice, critical development, post-development, and decolonial theories to reimagine how to do climate adaptation in a just and equitable manner. His current research investigates the impact of climate buffer infrastructure as climate adaptation in the Philippines. Do you want to say hi, Justin?
Thanks, Clement. Hi, everyone. Very happy to be here.
Fantastic. So we have Nazir Alfa Mohammed, who is a lawyer, policy analyst, and academic in the field of energy and extractive resource governance, especially in oil, gas, and mining sectors. He is currently a lecturer at the University of Ghana School of Law, where he has been teaching aspects of oil and gas law. As a lawyer and consultant, Nazir currently works as a senior associate consultant at the Ale Nachian Associates, a private law firm in Accra, Ghana, where he provides legal opinions and consulting services to oil, gas, and mining companies. At the policy front, Nazir previously served as a member of the Public Interest and Accountability Committee, representing the Ghana Bar Association in Ghana. He also worked as policy advocacy officer with the Natural Resource Governance Institute, during which he led the Resource Governance Institute's legal reform and policy advocacy agenda in Ghana. So that's a huge profile there. Nazir, do you want to say hi so you can pop on the screen?
Hi, everyone. Nice
Fantastic.
having me here. Yeah, thank you.
Great. And then we have Dr. Annette Hoops. Okay. I'm very sorry, please. Annette, you can mention your surname again when you come on screen. So Annette is a chief research officer in the Global Risk Governance Program in the Public Law Department at the University of Cape Town, where she is also responsible for Environmental and Planetary Futures Research Group. Her current research focuses on the governance of safety and security, with a specific focus on the structure and functioning of illegal markets, natural resource extraction, especially around oil and gas, and environmental restorative justice, as well as the interface between licit and illicit economies and criminal networks. Annette, do you want to say hi and please mention your surname again so people can hear you?
Hi, everyone. So the surname is Hübschle, but don't worry. Most people call me Dr. Annette, so it's all good. Nice to meet everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you, Doc. And then this name is easier to mention. Dr. Evan Haman holds Bachelor of Law and Bachelor of Commerce, a Master's in Environmental Science and Law, and a PhD. His research focuses on questions of implementation and compliance with environmental law. He has an ongoing interest in the role of regulations in governance, as well as the phenomenon of ESG, which is environmental, social, and corporate governance, and its use by corporate actors. Evan is co-author of 2 recently published books, which are Implementing the World Heritage Convention, The Politics of Compliance, and Natural Capital, Agriculture, and Law, all published by Edward Elgar, very recently indeed. Do you want to say hi, Evan, so people can see you?
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Clement. Great to be here.
Fantastic. Thank you. Now, the last but not the least, Nicholas Pope is an early career researcher at King's College London with a background in political economy and geography. He's currently working on his Green Transitions Risk Project about the social and ecological risks linked to the drive for critical minerals required for the energy transitions. He focuses mainly in the Amazon rainforest area. Hi, Nicholas, you want to say hi?
Hi, everyone.
Great. Now, let me welcome you all once again. Like I said in the beginning, please feel free to type in questions when you have one and engage with the experts we have here today so we can make the best of the interactions. Now, let me direct my first question to you, Annette. And I'm really fascinated about the global risk aspect of your work. And so do you want to give an overview of the opportunities and challenges that the world faces today regarding climate and environmental sustainability, especially based on your work on global risk governance and other research and interactions with stakeholders globally and in Africa? Because I know you've done a lot. Your recent work was on, is it green criminality? That's really quite interesting. Came out last week or so. So do you want to, walk us through what we need to know around opportunities and challenges regarding climate and environmental sustainability?
Thank you so much, Clement. So let me just start off by mentioning in general terms that what we do in the Global Risk Governance Program, so I'm basically a scholar at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. I'm actually speaking to you from Kruger National Park, where I'm attending a big natural science conference at the moment. So we kind of work at the interface between natural and social science, so it's very interdisciplinary, and we're trying to understand what we call harmscapes, which is a very new concept. It was developed by two of my colleagues, Clifford Shearing and Julie Burke. And we're basically trying to understand risks and harms and sort of as a complex issue. So we're not just looking at a crime at hand, but the broader landscape of harms and risks. So just to turn to the topic that we're discussing today. So Clemens, you're quite right. I just published a very interesting article with fellow African scholars in Botswana and Namibia. I'm actually originally from Namibia. And we're discussing the issue of oil and gas exploration. And basically during COVID-19, early on in 2020, in Namibia and Botswana, there was suddenly rumors of a Canadian company that had arrived on our shores. The company was basically telling its investors that it was going to do fracking near the Okavango Delta. So I don't know if everybody knows the Okavango Delta. It's quite famous. It's one of the biggest biodiversity hotspots. It's also a source of water for most of Southern Africa. So to hear that a Canadian company would be fracking near that delta was very, very concerning. So I ended up getting involved as a sort of, let's call me like a scholar activist, and I assisted in the establishment of a small NGO in Namibia and Botswana just to assist local people to actually start a campaign and just get some more information about what was going on. But just to come to key points. So basically what we've been seeing with this, just as a case study, this oil and gas exploration in Namibia and Botswana, is that our civil society in Namibia and Botswana it still needs a lot of help in setting up. And unfortunately, those people living near extractive industry sites are usually the most affected. I mean, that doesn't take a scholar to tell you. So basically what we saw in Namibia and Botswana is that indigenous peoples are living right near the site. There was zero consultation with local people, and basically the pretext of COVID-19 was used. So basically the company, so the frackers or the oil and gas company, whatever you want to call them, they actually had special permits, essential work permits to work and extract and start the exploratory work, whereas local people, activists and civil society could not move. So that was number one. Another thing that we saw very quickly in the Namibian context was that international NGOs that are much better resourced than local NGOs jumped into the space, and they started dominating a lot of the responses. So there was this talk of saving biodiversity and, being very concerned about water, which of course are very valuable points, but there was very, very little concern about the good fortunes, the livelihoods of local people. So which includes both local communities and indigenous peoples. So I suppose what I kind of want to say here is it's really, really important to amplify the voices of local communities and indigenous peoples. And really, obviously, international NGOs and multinational organizations are much needed. And we do need resources, we need capacity, but basically such organizations need to listen to locals. They need to take instructions and take a step back. So basically amplify local voices instead of pursuing your own sort of organizational needs and that sort of stuff. What else can I tell you? I think something that struck me in this space when we talk about resilience and extraction and the issue of environmental crimes and harms is that we still suffering from basically colonial our colonial heritage on the African continent. So the impacts of colonialist extraction are very visible, but we also have this new sense of, some people would call it neo-colonial extraction. So we do have international companies, often mining houses, but also it's now fine rare metals, you know, that are needed. There are all sorts of things that we need. Even for me to be on this call right now, I'm sitting on a laptop computer, and you know, a lot of the ingredients used to make the modern technologies actually come from the African continent and from other global South contexts. So in essence, we have this continuation of extraction dating back to the colonial period, but we're seeing renewed extraction or ongoing extraction. And it partially involves old colonial sort of ties, but there are also a lot of new players that are basically coming to our shores. And I think this kind of talks directly to the notion of the resource curse, which is sort of a big word that we've often heard in the past. I think it is very important to look at both environmental and human rights abuses when it comes to this extraction. What we found, just in terms of the piece that I published last week with my fellow scholars, was this disconnect between basically extraction on the one hand and wanting development on the other hand. And this is often being weaponized by both government actors, so public actors that are often in cahoots with extractors, and then, of course, the extractors themselves. So they will say, we're coming, we're providing much needed development. And just to come back to this oil extraction in Namibia, the exploration work, which has been ongoing for a while now, basically what keeps on happening is that the extractors are actually going to local communities and they're saying, hey, we're here to help you develop. We're sinking boreholes. We're providing some much needed services. So there's this very strange interplay on the one hand of neo-colonial extraction, and then also the need for socioeconomic development. And I think this is like, we need to think outside the box to better address this. I think something else that I really want to mention is the importance of women. We tend to forget that often women are the most marginalized in African contexts. So we have both a racial and patriarchal exploitation of sorts. So huge parts of African society are still, it's patriarchal society. So women have very little say and very little agency. So it is extremely important to focus on women and their livelihoods. And we found that lots of studies that show if you empower women and you provide them tools for example, just agricultural productions, then children are better looked after, just the general living standards standard rises. So just wanted to mention this. And in terms of recommendation on how to better deal with these issues, just even as a researcher, I find, you know, I cannot just go into communities and preach or just extract. Research can be exactly the same as some of these extracting companies that I'm talking about, it is really, really important to co-design solutions. So, what I mean by that is you actually go and interact with affected communities and speak to them and find out what it is that they actually want in terms of solutions, in terms of future development. And principally, it's really, really important to consider policies and actions that consider our unique cultural, social, and economic context in Africa and in African communities. I think I've talked a lot of the time already, so I'm going to leave it at this as my first sort of intervention. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Annette. And I'm really, fascinated about that. Normally we think about the companies and their interventions and other things, but obviously you brought in even the researcher dimension as well, so that we can have more holistic interventions there. So obviously you've spoken about approaches of companies, governments, and do you think communities and civil society can do more to avert some of these risks you've mentioned? And I'll go to Evan in a moment as well, but just to pick your thought still on that. What else can organized members of society do?
So I think it is really, really important to capacitate, provide both material and other support to local communities. So just to give you an example of, again, going back to this oil and gas case study that I've been working with. So my sort of social responsibility work was to actually literally speak to community members and ask them what they need. And what we ended up doing, from a position of privilege and, where I come from, I reached out to EIA, so environmental impact assessment practitioners, just to get a sense, what is it that we need to contest? How can we, just in terms of research and knowledge, how can we actually contribute? How can we assist people? So we basically have provided bridges in terms of connecting local people to sources of knowledge and expertise. But then the other thing that is quite important is to also provide some input on further development. So, livelihood strategies, connecting people to sources of financing. And that is often difficult when you're living in a rural community where you don't have data, you don't have internet, you don't have transportation, and also you can't write project proposals. So all of us sitting in this in the Zoom room, we have computers, we've got data, and we all speak English. And a lot of grants are unfortunately usually in English. Sometimes you're lucky to have French or other languages, but a lot of people that I deal with on a rural level, they speak African languages, and they speak some English or some other colonial language that was left behind, whether it be French or Portuguese. But it's very, very difficult to tap into funding sources. So I think it is really, really important to connect the local to the global, and also to make sure that not too much money is directed to people like myself. It's like these experts that come in, and often you have experts actually getting a lot of the money instead of it going directly to the community. So we need to trust community to know what their priorities are and really empower them on that level.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I was thinking as well as you spoke, does it all fit into your notion of, let's say, justice or justice and equity in the transitions at all, or would you have another understanding of that? No, I'm still on you, Annette.
Oh, you're still on me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry.
But obviously, I mean, yeah, when I get to the others, they might also respond to that as well. Yeah.
No problem, Clement. So, for me, my understanding of justice is quite a multiple aspects to justice. There's environmental justice, there's social justice, there's economic justice. So we can't just separate them from each other. And I think by and large, we need to sort of have a whole of society response. And it is quite important if you're talking about justice, you know, people often say, well, you know, there's the criminal justice system that deals with aspects of justice, but we also have to deal with reparation of past ills and, you know, how to uplift, you know, people that live in generational poverty, which, you know, obviously is linked to, you know, colonialism. In the case of South Africa, where I live now, or even Namibia, we also had apartheid. So there are the forms of reparation that need to happen, and you know they're often done by public sector actors, so by government and various entities. But you know, I think the international community, NGOs all have a role to play to implement, you know, this sort of multidimensional form of justice.
Fabulous. Thank you. Thank you. I think now I can let you breathe. Annette, thank you. No, I like the whole of society dimension you bring into the conversation of justice, which obviously, because you've not gotten that right yet, you know, justice often defined from all kinds of perspectives, from government, from investors, you know, and so yeah. If we don't get that right, I'm sure the interventions will still will be gotten wrongly anyway. So now, I mean, Evans, you have been doing, you know, quite a bit of work on environment, social, and corporate governance regulations that target both domestic audience in Australia, but also international audiences, mainly through Australian mining companies and other companies that work internationally. So based on all these, the challenges that Annette has laid out, and obviously your own understanding, how well do you think that regulations or laws can facilitate better relationship between governments, private sector, ordinary people who are impacted by climate action or environmental sustainability, having in mind that about the complexity there, you know, so the law, how does it work? How does it fit into that whole, you know, complexity?
Yeah, thanks, Clement. Just before I start, so I'm in Canberra, Australia at the moment, and it's traditional here for us to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm on, who are the local Ngunnawal people. You know, it was fascinating listening to Annette unpack some of those practical examples, which is really quite sad to hear it's still going on. And when she gave the example that there was no community consultation in terms of biodiversity, the Okavango Delta is one of the most, you know, spectacular biodiverse places in Africa, if not the planet. You know, it's got overlays of protected area status. It's a Ramsar site. So it's sad to hear that level of destruction, for want of a better word, or potential destruction, is still going on. You know, there's the kind of stories you heard, like, you know, 30, 40, 50 years ago, that there was no consultation that took place. You know, increasingly we're hearing stories of poor consultation, ticker box types exercises. But, you know, right at the end of the spectrum, that's quite poor to hear. Coming to the question of ESG. So ESG, for those who don't really know, and I guess I'll give a bit of a segue into how I came interested in it, stands for environmental, social, and governance factors. Broadly speaking, it's a kind of a framework that's up until now been voluntary. Major corporations like to throw around their ESG credentials. They produce reports, often known as sustainability reports, that talk about what they're doing in terms of environmental factors, and that is broader than climate. That includes water, it includes pollution, soil degradation, forestation, et cetera, social issues. So in terms of, for example, payments to workers, whether they're using any form of dodgy labor in the businesses or along the supply chains, working conditions, labor, human rights, things like that. And of course, governance, you know, on the board. And the, you know, kind of proxy for that at the moment is, well, how many of this gender do you have on the board and in your company? So that's the very top of the, you know, the kind of exploration of G. but it also goes into other things like, the accountability, the transparency, use of privacy, protection of privacy and so forth. So ESG is that kind of, broad framing. Some of you may have come across concepts like corporate social responsibility, which was the kind of older language, and triple bottom line accounting, those types of things. So I guess my segue into it, and it kind of talks a bit to what Annette was talking about, was I noticed that my research focuses on international environmental law, and I'm looking at kind of, how that can be better implemented on the ground, albeit those frameworks themselves are not perfect. So two of the conventions I look at are the World Heritage Convention and the Ramsar Convention. And I noticed about probably 5 or 6 years ago, a lot of the big banks, including UK banks, which are providing finance for these, mining and other big projects, signed up to voluntary commitments that they're not going to explore for or extract minerals in World Heritage sites or Ramsar sites. Some of them do both. There's about 30 plus major corporations that have said we're not going to finance these in arrangements in these areas of very significant heritage and biodiversity value. Prior to that, in about 2003, there was a International Mining and Minerals Organization, which is a collective of some of the world's biggest mining companies, was actually the first mover in that space. In a way, it's kind of early manifestation of ESG taking place. And of course, there's other voluntary, non-binding frameworks out there at the international level. For the banks, there's the Equator Principles. There's also multinational guidelines released by the OECD, which are excellent. So in a nutshell, at this kind of global level, we have frameworks that are meant to be implemented by state parties. So obligations under World Heritage, Ramsar, Convention on Biological Diversity, Convention on Migratory Species, UNFCCC, you name it. State parties have the obligations under those. But what's happening in the private sphere is this kind of private environmental governance going on. And up until now, as I said, it's kind of been voluntary and about, the marketing aspects of it. But increasingly, and particularly in the European Union, you're seeing mandatory reporting on companies' ESG credentials, starting with climate emissions. But I think the trajectory is to move towards, impacts on nature, biodiversity, water, more broadly. The extent to which that's actually effective in some of these, on the ground issues, which Annette was talking about and dealing with, is really out for debate. I mean, there's a big chunk of it that is really just kind of greenwashing and marketing spill. And then there's another chunk of it, which is about disclosure for investors. I mean, talking about at a level of disclosure, well, all we have to do is report it, and then people can make up their own minds whether they want to invest at us or do business with us and so on and so forth. It doesn't then go the next step of accountability. And of course, people have challenges of access to information that sit behind private paywalls and so forth. Anyway, to wrap up with your question of, what can the law do and what can't it do? I think it has a fundamental role to play at different scales, though, right? So you're talking about this international level. It's fragmented. There are different principles. There are different focuses of these conventions. There are different guidelines and so forth. Nevertheless, it can help to standardize some fundamental principles. And human rights law is a perfect example of that. Embedding some of those concepts down in the national, subnational, and local levels at least takes on some level of legitimacy. But then you've got where the rubber really hits the road, which is the local laws and regulations. And in that sense, you've probably got two things going on. You've got your public law approaches. So you kind of, what has the state introduced in terms of environmental protection? Are there requirements for consultation and so on and so forth? And then you've got this kind of private angle as well, which is, the compensation that might be paid by a company to a community, or the contracts that are entered into. So it splits the legal dynamics at that stage. And the legitimacy of both of those is certainly up for grabs. But yeah, I hope I kind of, talked in and around your question, and I'll pass the mic to other people now who have more interesting things to say.
No, that's very interesting. I like the point about ESG now replacing corporate social responsibility as a new concept, and the dimensions of it that are not enforceable to extent, but mainly for PR, but also reporting purposes. And back to the question of justice. Therefore, do you think the law, as the world moved to, and I'm still on you, Evan, as the world moves towards energy transitions and thinks about justice and equity, do you have a sense that ESG regulations can make any impact at all in this?
Yeah, I mean, the question of justice, as you were talking about before, is an enormous one, and there's so many angles you can look at it. Generally, and at least the way I teach students in the law school here, that the concepts of law and justice are not synonymous. Law is the tool or the intervention technique available to governments that essentially reinforces the political and economic values for what got them into power in the first place. So to a certain extent, they're balancing that up with, questions of justice to the most vulnerable people in society. If you flipped it and in Australia, for example, we have very few constitutional protections that speak to vulnerable people. And the recent example of, The Voice, which we spoke about your time in Australia, is a perfect example of that, and attempting to enshrine some higher level of justice for vulnerable populations, very, very difficult at a constitutional level, meaning therefore that the law changes, it evolves depending on the politics of the party at play. I understand that some of the African countries, potentially South Africa, have excellent constitutions that talk about, well, excellent at least, compared to us. And to that extent, perhaps it's easier to embed kind of norms around, environmental social justice that look after the most vulnerable people in society. But here it takes on a flavor of politics and vested interests. And if you want to get kind of, Foucauldian about it, it's law is a tool for power, and that's essentially what it's reflecting. So the extent to which you can move it towards the question of justice is really a political one, I think. At least here, but yeah, hopefully that provided some more information.
No, that's amazing. No, I like all the nuances in there, which I think is going to generate a lot of conversation. So we'll leave it there. We'll come back to that. And I think the theme that runs through the conversation, as you know already, is the issue of justice, equity, and the fact that even the law cannot help us address that yet. That's really interesting. Now, let me come to you, Nazir. I mean, you've had enormous experience in the legal and regulatory environment in Ghana, where, as reported often, and based on my little experience there as well, there's often this tension between the state actors and civil society who represent members of society generally. Now, what do you consider to be the fundamental drivers of this tension between officials responsible for climate action or environmental sustainability and non-state actors who are often impacted the most by climate change and environmental deprivation? Having in mind the question of the law, justice, and all that, how do we unpack this and make sure the state and non-state actors can work together to towards this desired objective? You're muted, I think, Nazir.
Thanks so much for that question. Listening to Ivan, there is one thing that is very fundamental when it comes to the important role that ESG plays, or law generally plays, in climate protection, for example. And so you would realize that domestic law would generally insist that the local communities are protected through law or regulation. And yet, in practice, even though these protections are ingrained in the law, duty bearers may not be willing or may be unable or would just simply don't want to follow some of these rules and regulations. So at the first point of call that we have to look at, it is that of the fact that some duty bearers are unwilling to actually implement the law as is provided for under domestic law, for example. And as civil society, if you look at organized civil society versus unorganized, I just want to put it that way because some of the civil society organizations are registered entities, either international entities that are domesticated, or we just have domestic national civil societies. But we do also have the communities themselves, where some of these activities are going on, who are not necessarily a registered civil society, for example, and yet duty bearers are supposed to be consulting all of these, groups of institutions or persons in order to be able to have sustainable climate action or climate adaptation and climate protection rules and regulations for the society. So first, once civil society realizes that these laws are there and that duty bearers are supposed to ensure that they take them into consideration to consult local society, and they are not doing so, that is the first point of tension between civil society and the duty bearers. Then duty bearers, are raising the issue of, you are mandated by law to do ABCD. You are mandated by law to consult us on this issue before going ahead with it. You haven't done so. So why are you going ahead to even commence doing what you are not supposed to do? And so that is the first point that civil society, that often bring this kind of tension between civil society and then the government actors. The second point may be about prioritization and competing interests. Well, government itself may prioritize economic concerns more than they would prioritize environmental concerns. So in Ghana today, the economy is not so good. So the priority in the mind of the governing elite is that they have to put in place all the necessary, things that they have to put in place to ensure that the economy is back on track. So if that means going more into fossil fuels, they will have to do so. If that means that they will have to mine more, they would have to do so, even including the illegal mining activities that are going on, which involve sometimes politicians themselves. So in Ghana today, we have a huge problem with galamsey. And galamsey is like the local parlance for illegal mining, properly so-called, and which is bringing a lot of environmental degradation in Ghana. Yet all attempts, by the state itself and even the community to try to stop this galamsey, it's not proven successful. Sometimes the community itself will organize themselves and then take on these illegal mining activities, knowing very well that it is spoiling or it is bringing some environmental concerns to themselves, which will affect them today and will affect, intergenerational, the intergenerations that will come after us. And yet they don't mind. They go ahead and they continue these illegal mining activities, all because of how government or state actors have prioritized some of these things. So if you put economic activities or you prioritize economic activity to the disadvantage of the environmental activities, that might also bring a lot of tension between civil society and then government actors, and it does most of the time. Then we talk about lack of transparency and accountability. I realize that Ivan touched a bit on that, but of course, in establishing laws or enacting laws, you need as much as possible to be transparent. And after having been transparent with civil society and the communities, you also have to be accountable. Now, in some instances in Ghana, there have been instances where laws are passed in respect of some activities, but civil society is not sufficiently engaged, even though local laws or domestic laws may actually require that they be consulted. And so, of course, civil society might not be happy. They will have to advocate on some of those issues. That the fact that they have not been consulted by government, and yet such a law is coming, especially if the outcome of the law is such that it is actually detrimental to the environmental sustainability of the country. So, for example, there was a recent legislative instrument that actually declassifies forest areas, from being protected areas of the land, suggesting that now that they have been declassified as such, you may actually go into those areas for other human activities, which are not necessarily protecting the forest environment and all of that. And so for such actions, civil society will not sit unconcerned. Civil society will naturally come to the, to defend all of society by insisting that these are areas that by international law and domestic law, we are supposed to preserve, for the future generations and not to go into it right now. So as at now, for those who may have been researching Ghana, you would realize that we have forest zones in Ghana where currently we have illegal mining going on in this country. And that is crazy. So civil society would naturally feel that government is not considering the environmental impact of what is going on, and then there will be that concern. Then policy implementation challenges also exist at the same time. So there are laws that prohibit illegal mining, for example. So if there are laws prohibiting illegal mining, and then there's some research in Ghana that suggests that most of the illegal mining going on in Ghana, for example, we have some of the political elite being the underground owners, And meanwhile, we have a law that talks about beneficial ownership, disclosure in this country. And yet, we can have people fronting for politicians to engage in illegal mining, in this country. And yet, nothing is happening to some of these people. In some cases, we have politicians openly declaring that they are engaged in illegal mining and that nothing can happen to them. And yet, the law is not able to catch up with some of these persons. So definitely, there will be that tension between civil society and non-state actors against those of state actors in respect of, obligations that are laid out in law to be enforced by these state actors or duty bearers, which they are not doing right. So clearly, we have a number of drivers that are actually fueling this tension between civil society or non-state actors and then the state actors. For me, the way forward is for us to have, a clear collaborative way of doing things. State actors must, identify, or they have to embrace the fact that you cannot do this without the non-state actors. You need to carry the communities along. You need to carry the voices of conscience along with you in trying to achieve environmental sustainability in Ghana and wherever it is. And so for me, yes, we have some drivers that are fueling this tension, but to be able to ensure that we don't have that kind of tension between civil society or non-state actors and state actors, then state actors must be prepared always to engage us, in a collaborative manner, for constructive dialogue on how best to protect our environment. Maybe if they are
fabulous. Yeah, thanks so much, Nazir. I think that really hammers down on some of the we've identified, and so we leave the law bit, the state society engagement there as we go along. I mean, there are several questions as well that already in the Q&A section. Please, panelists, take a look when you can, and then I'll come back to you to respond to them once we are done with the full cycle of interventions. And please, if you are here, feel free to type in your questions and we'll address them in due course. So, Veronica, you have an interesting background. I mean, you've been involved in negotiations and financing of climate and sustainability in Zimbabwe and elsewhere in East Africa, which is fascinating. So my question to you, what scope does financing play in the relationship building between the state and members of society? And obviously, there's always this tension there. How does financing play any role at all? And does it matter at all whether it's foreign capital or domestically generated capital? How is money important in this whole conversation? I think you're on mute, Veronica. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Clement. Thank you to all the listeners and the previous presenters. Indeed, financing is a very critical component, especially when it comes to governance issues and climate advancements. One important element, especially for climate financing, is around how governments can work with communities in developing inclusive programs, especially for adaptation and mitigation, both towards low carbon development and building the needed resilience. But I think what is also fundamental from a money perspective, with the additional layer that has been attributed to climate, is to realize that domestic financing or public sector financing hasn't largely been sufficient to cover the additional costs associated with climate change. And as a result, you find that the communities and the society remain burdened by the impacts of climate change, and the governments are not in a position to deal with such challenges. And I'll give an example of Cyclone Idai that affected Southern Africa, especially Zimbabwe, Malawi, and Mozambique. That has been about 4 or 5 years ago, but countries have not been able to recover from that cyclone. And Malawi and Mozambique were equally hit by Cyclone Fred in about a year or two ago, which added an additional layer of impact to the communities and the society. And they haven't been able to recover. So the aspects of financing, especially how the financing is structured, becomes very important. Looking at the recently launched Loss and Damage Fund, the way it is going to be operationalized, the way it is going to be accessed, it will mean a lot both to the state and as well as to the society, because then it will determine how much more can the government access to support the society to restore and recover from the losses that they would have experienced. And as the financing gap widens, you realize that also the justice issues widen, because the question is about how then do we ensure that the financing is flowing to those areas where it is needed the most. So the marginalized and vulnerable communities become more marginalized, become more vulnerable, because the finances available are very tight. So it is important to then understand how can governments use domestic and public sector financing to leverage both domestic private sector financing and international public and private sector financing. So the aspect of being able to unlock international and private sector financing becomes very important, especially in terms of trying to close the funding gap, both for adaptation and for mitigation. And if you look at the instruments of financing that have occurred over time, mitigation financing has increased because of the different financing instruments beyond the traditional grants and loans. So now you begin to see a lot of green guarantees, you begin to see green bond financing, which is then enabling mitigation action to take place. But adaptation financing remains very minimal. Parties have called for doubling of adaptation financing, but that still is not sufficient. So communities and the society at large remains equally vulnerable to deal with the impacts of climate change, and also to mobilize more funding to support the actions on the ground. Because adaptation is think globally but act locally. So it's more around local action, and that's where the aspects of consultation and participation become very important, so that whatever adaptation initiative that the government is implementing, it is inclusive, it is gender responsive, because we know that the impacts of climate change are not gender neutral. Women and men, boys and girls are affected differently. And just this morning, I attended a meeting, and one colleague stood up and introduced himself using sign language. And the next thing the person was sharing was saying, "Who can interpret for us?" And then he laughed and said, "No, I wanted to find out how inclusive your meeting is, you know." So it is those small things which we take for granted, but we forget that whatever financing comes into countries, or whatever financing is domestically mobilized in the countries, has to be inclusive. It has to address the elements of justice. It has to address the elements of equity. It has to address the elements of equality. So how do we, where there need to be even more affirmative to take those actions to close the disparities that exist? So there's importance of public engagement and participation of the society across the different elements. And I think Annette really highlighted the elements of justice, that is not only about environmental justice, but it's also about economic justice. It's also about social justice. So how do we ensure that the financial flows are flowing in a way to close the gap and enable that justice to exist? So we should not make sure that those who are affected by a cyclone, their lives become worse off after a cyclone, and they are never recovered, or they don't recover from that cyclone. So we should structure our financing in a way that those that are affected by a cyclone, they can still recover and be able to continue with their lifestyles. So the aspect of not leaving anyone behind becomes very important. The aspect of not doing anyone no harm becomes very important. So how is the financing flowing? Is it causing harm? I think it's even touching fundamental issues, even around the issues of carbon credits. Where the owners of the forest are then asked to move out of the areas that they've lived in for the past 20, 30 years, because someone then has to access monies on carbon credits. But the question is, how do we ensure that all those financial flows flow in an integral way? And also they flow in a more transparent way, and we can account for the resources, both from a social lens, from a financial economic lens, and also from an environmental lens. So that is very important. And then also when you talk about financing as it relates to economic opportunities and job creation, how do we structure the finance flows to be directed where they can close the development gap? So we need to ensure that the finances are more structured to support not just development, but sustainable development, green development, where we don't leave the environment worse off, but we are able to reclaim, areas, degraded areas. We are able to harness non-timber forest products, but still leave the forest pristine. And also even within the value chains, the societies are the ones who live with this forest. So we allow them to benefit, but also ensure that they take care of the areas and the forest that they live in. So the aspect of ownership also becomes very important as well. And of course, I think if it's not Nicholas who also touched around transparency and accountability, we can never really overemphasize the importance of accountability and transparency. How much of the resources are being mobilized as a result of fiscal co-financing to international funding? What are the capacity needs of the society as well? Because there was an issue of saying that the money should not just go to government, but we should trust the communities that they can manage the resources. So I always tell people that money is a trust game. So if it has to flow to the community, has the community or the society been capacitated enough to be able to account for those resources? So we need to close the gap right from government to the civil society, to the private sector, to the community, the local community that we live in, who are the basic implementers of the adaptation initiatives and technologies, so that everybody can then report within their layer of operationalization and implementation of the initiatives that are being funded. And then I think also looking at the state and the society, it's also around risk management. How do we manage financial risk attributed to society and attributed to the state as well? Because if you are going to make renewable energy financing or adaptation financing flow into Africa, it will flow at a rate of 7 to 15% in terms of interest, because we are told that it is a high-risk continent. So by the time that money gets to the basic community, it is so expensive. and the society does not afford it. So how do we then structure risk mitigation tools that are favorable for national governments and they don't become highly indebted? Because the moment the governments are highly indebted, the person who then carries that burden is the society. So I think it is very important to then really ensure that we close the gap by making sure that whatever financing we mobilize really supports and unlocks quality financing to design inclusive and climate just programs and initiatives. Thank you very much.
Now that's amazing. That's amazing. Thanks so much. I mean, I love the bit about money being a trust game. And I mean, obviously, the fact that communities are not capacitated, assuming that's the case, to manage their finance doesn't even mean that they should be denied the opportunity to manage it themselves if they want to, except that you probably just need to think about how can you then capacitate them, which will be an important driver there. I know there are several questions coming in. Annette has started responding to some of them by text. We'll get to them soon. I just have another 2 rounds and then we can get to the questions now. But very interesting perspectives there. Thank you. And I see the connection between all the areas that all come together around justice and equity, but also around relationship. And so, Nicholas, you are an Amazon scholar. You know, you've been, your work in the Amazon area is quite interesting, especially regarding the role of militia groups, corruption, and what we call coercive brokerage in devastating the forest zone. Do you want to walk us through what good and bad relationship looks like in the Amazon forest community? And to what extent you think that reversals in some of the things you've mentioned as the drivers of the devastation can restore trust and relationship building in communities?
Yeah, thanks very much, Clement, for the question. I wanted to start really just by, I guess, contextualizing the region I'm currently working in, so we can think about it in its context, not just for its, huge biodiversity and the role, as a global carbon sink, but also, the vast size of it. It's 7 million square kilometers, and it's home to 47 million people, with at least 410 indigenous groups and nations. So it's really a very complex social, historical, and cultural place, as well as an environmental place as well. So I guess some of my research is starting to think about these, bringing these dimensions together and thinking about it holistically. So, even though as much as 45% of the region is classified as protected by conservation or indigenous demarcations, it really is not immune to exploitation. And in my research, I'm starting to look at some of these episodes of exploitation as a way of thinking about some of the questions of justice and equity that we're here talking about today. So, in these remote regions, they're really far away from a lot of the big cities. Local forms of governance often act, and they intersect with, different economic incentives, some of which we've been talking about today. And, I've seen a lot of cases where this is benefiting local violent intermediaries, or as you've mentioned, Clement, I work with the term coercive brokerage to think about these actors. And so we might think about these actors as different types of armed groups or armed individuals who are working maybe with one foot in the political arena. So we've got examples like the Colombia FARC, paramilitary groups. We've also got more kind of economic actors, criminal groups like the First Capital Command in Brazil, who are working with illicit economies and drug production, cocaine trafficking. Or there might be more local groups. So we're talking about local and less organized groups who are linked to maybe artisanal mining or local forms of deforestation. So we're talking here about security actors, death squads, extermination groups, and so forth as well. So I guess what I'm saying is these actors are really often, at least in part, driven by the allure of rich resources. We see their involvement in a variety of different economies, but also they're motivated and they have connections with social and political causes as well. So I think that's kind of some of the research I'm looking at in terms of thinking a bit beyond, just the economic side of this and thinking about what else is driving and motivating them. So, I mean, especially in this context, in the Amazon rainforest, where actually it's a very rich region in terms of resources, but, some of the conversation we've talked about today around critical minerals, and mining, which is where my research focuses, is actually it's a rich region in terms of these resources. And you see a lot of companies and governments are kind of wrestling with these challenges in terms of doing business in these very difficult to access areas. And these informal brokers are really kind of seizing on the opportunities and capitalizing on these weaknesses of formal businesses in terms of being able to access and do business in these spaces that are either protected or very difficult to access because there's no infrastructure. So what we see is these actors are kind of taking on either the business themselves, and they're doing the exploration, they're doing the kind of extraction in some cases, depending on the mineral, or they're building alliances with and partnerships with other types of actors, so with either government actors, with state actors, or with business actors as well. And we see these kind of coalitions of actors with overlapping interests. And I guess, you know, this scramble for resources poses both a significant threat to environmental preservation and in local forms of sovereignty as well. So we've talked a lot about, you know, indigenous sovereignties in this discussion already. And I think these are really interlinked, and I think we have to kind of think about these as overlapping issues. So within this context, you know, different actors overlap, and many of them, as I mentioned, with overlapping but also diverging interests and incentives. So we've got, you know, your local communities, many of them just aiming to survive amid, you know, economic or ecological challenges, businesses navigating legal, legislative, or security challenges, and also governments who are trying to hold on to power, perform basic functions in different ways. And we've got your investor stakeholders as well, who are, you know, as Evan mentioned before, kind of navigating these kind of incoming ESG considerations and balancing those against the trade-offs involved with kind of thinking about more lucrative investments that don't have these ESG considerations as well. So each group of actors has its own kind of set of priorities, and I guess they're all in different ways trying to claim a stake on these resources. And so I guess I wanted to talk quickly today about a case in the Putumayo region of Colombia, so that's on the Ecuadorian-Peruvian border, which I've started to look at. And this is the story of Libero Cobre, which is a subsidiary of a Canadian company. Again, we've talked about Canada already today, called Libero Copper, who are currently exploring for copper in this region in Colombia, in the Amazon in Colombia. And there's been a focus on this project following promises of economic prosperity and its potential for reducing reliance in the region on illicit economy. So, you know, until recently, there's been a big focus from the FARC, from the paramilitaries, in terms of coca production and coca trafficking. And they've seen this as an opportunity to replace it with a green-focused industry and green-focused economy, which has been really kind of at the heart of government discussions and discourse around this topic. However, you know, we look into some of the dynamics of this investment and where some of the funding and financing is coming from. We're looking at, you know, some quite notable donor investors coming from. We see the Sununu family in the US, who's a US Republican Party dynasty, who hold probably the largest stake in the company. And two of those who are known publicly in the US are actually really kind of quite prominent climate change skeptics, and one of them is on the board of directors, right? So we see this kind of, you know, this tension between, you know, who's in the governance of this company and actually what the company is being sold at the local level in terms of this green transition. And we see concerns over environmental degradation, indigenous rights, which are looming large, and there are various legal challenges, conflicts with local residents, reports to human rights, international human rights bodies as well. And, you know, in the face of mounting opposition, there's big questions of legality and indigenous consultation, which have become much louder in recent years. And so indigenous mandates for prior free and informed consent, they really clash with what we're seeing on the ground and the realities on the ground. So there's this kind of tension that we've also talked about today in terms of these legal frameworks and political economic interests. So in Macau, which is the city nearby where Libero Copper operates, we've actually seen quite a lot of armed groups who have been kind of functioning in this region, who have been using the presence of local illicit crops to justify their presence in the region. So in this instance, they're claiming they want to eradicate the illicit crops. But at the same time, they're kind of acting in the interests of the mining organization as well. And they're using threats and violence to silence community voices who are speaking out against mining activities. And they're also using, divisions in the community to create, to fracture social and political relationships as well across the communities, and play communities off against each other. So, although we don't have data yet on the explicit links between the mining activities and the roles of these armed groups, we are seeing some evidence of their involvement. And the literature on similar dynamics elsewhere suggests that there might be beneficial outcomes for armed groups when resource extraction like this is in play. So it shows how coercion and violence, often in the context of impunity, because of political relationships, often poses a real threat, not only to human lives, but to those who are speaking out on behalf of the environment as well, and protecting the environment from a civil society or local community perspective. So I'm looking through this kind of lens of violent activity to understand some of these relationships that lead to some of the most destructive and violent outcomes, both for the environment, but also socially as well. So I guess just to close up, really, I mean, to think about some of these issues, I think it's important to take a holistic view of the topic. So until now, a lot of these discussions have been around policing and security and how to curb violence. But I think some of these issues are also linked to kind of discussions around how resources are being distributed, uneven forms of development, ecological management. And also kind of participation or lack of in policy making processes as well. So I think there might be a couple of areas that we could think about for a couple of more kind of concrete areas to advance this line of thinking. So as I say, kind of part of this is about the different overlapping informal rights and laws, and who or what has a seat at the table to negotiate different outcomes. And I guess in the region in Latin America, we have this very live discussion on indigenous rights and the ongoing discussion and negotiations around the ESACU agreement. But also, I mean, there's been a kind of long-standing discussion in Latin America around the ontologies of indigenous communities in terms of how we can imagine or rethink our relationship with nature as well. So it's really about attempting to shift our understanding of nature as about being property and in the kind of property rights sense, but defining the rights of nature itself as well, and embedding those in constitution as they have done in Ecuador. But obviously, we've also touched on this point that enforcement is an issue, and especially in these kind of very local, informal levels, where things like the abstract ideas, like the rights of nature, are quite hard to kind of pin down. And whilst more enforcement mechanisms might start to shift the dial, and political dialogue and local politics have a better chance of shifting, I think it might also be important to think about some of the different incentives of these different actors within their independent relationships, in order to think about how we can design and co-design interventions that can disincentivize destructive behaviors or violent behaviors, and incentivize behaviors that protect local environments and local communities. So examples might lead us to different thinking about interventions around the health, education, gender, industrial strategy interventions, with the shift in the focus away from this informal scramble for resources, for minerals, for resources in the Amazon, and instead concentrate our efforts on kind of more productive and less destructive dynamics, which are appropriate to the needs and demands of local communities, but also the local ecological system as well. Yeah, so I guess I'll just leave it there, but thanks very much, Clement.
Mm-hmm. No, thanks so much, Nick. Yeah, and I mean, I guess we are getting more and more towards I'm still, navigating that complexity of justice and equity, but also from all kinds of perspectives. And thanks for sharing the Amazon the case study as well, and all the dimensions there. Now, Justin, your most recent work, uses a very interesting and deep phrase. It says from silences to emergencies. And you've used decolonizing climate adaptation scholarship to unpack what that means. So what does this mean in the first place, from silences to emergencies? And how do we ensure that local voices and indigenous knowledge systems can be integrated into policy and practice of climate and sustainability beyond just the idea of it being an intellectual jargon? You know, so how does from silences to emergencies tell us at all?
Thanks very much, Clement. First of all, as Evan mentioned, this is the tradition here in Australia. I'd like to begin by acknowledging and paying my respect to the traditional owners of the land on which I am situated tonight. I am on the unceded and stolen land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I recognize that they flourish sustainably on this land for several millennia, protecting country for future generations. This paper, Clement, is all about that title. We need to move from silencing local indigenous knowledges and voices in climate change adaptation towards emergences. So it's not emergencies, it's emergences, emergence, to foreground and put their voices at the front and center of our climate and sustainability initiatives. What we've seen in this paper is exactly what Annette was talking about a while ago, that there seems to be a neo-colonial takeover of adaptation initiatives, particularly in the Global South. Sustainability and adaptation initiatives mainly rely on Eurocentric and modernist rationalities that tend to favor concrete infrastructures, concrete forms of knowing. And what we're arguing in the paper is that concrete, both physically and metaphorically, do not work well with the current uncertainties of our climate change, of our future climate, of what's happening right now. For example, there has been a preference for concrete infrastructures like seawalls, which are being developed in the global north, but uncritically implemented in the global south cities like Jakarta, like Manila, like Bangkok. How rationalist ways of knowing that discredits and labels indigenous and local knowledges as old school and superstitious, So this preoccupation with concrete leads to the suppression of indigenous and local knowledges, which in turn results to increased vulnerabilities and marginalization in our case study communities. For example, indigenous communities in the Philippines are looked down upon and being disrespected for their, kind of local ways of forecasting the weather. And this has resulted to their disenfranchisement, to the perception of, them being left out of their wider communities. In Vietnam, local authorities' efforts to promote very aggressive farming techniques has eventually led to an increase in the incidence of plant diseases and decreases in farmers' yield. In Fiji, the building of modern houses to supposedly flood-proof villages has in fact resulted to more flooding and the eventual destruction of a lot of cultural and totem plants because of the massive deforestation that was needed to build these houses. So that's one part of the paper, really foregrounding these legacies of imperial violence and colonial, that stems from colonial eras and how this lives on through climate and sustainability initiatives. And the second part of the paper is going beyond this framing of case study communities as hopeless victims of adaptation initiatives and climate risk. And this is where the importance of reframing comes in. Communities have their own ways of adapting. They have their own ways of flourishing in their own environments. And as Annette said, we need to amplify this. In the community development literature, this has always been preached. ABCD, right? Asset-based community development. But it's just really more talked about than practiced. Our case studies illustrate that indigenous and local people's agency, that they have their own ways to understand, to manage, to respond to climate change in their own ways. So for example, we've seen how indigenous communities in the Philippines, despite being ridiculed upon, they still assert their local knowledges and try to integrate them, fight for them in local discussions, especially with local governments. So to answer your second question, how do we ensure that local voices and indigenous knowledges can be integrated into policy and practice? And this question was also posed in the chat. How do we ensure that development does not come at the expense of indigenous and local communities? I can think of 4 things. First, prioritizing relationship building through physical presence, investing time in the field, engaging communities in a culturally responsive and respectful manner. Second, reframing. I talked about this. Communities not just as mere victims, but as agents who have their own agency, who have their own strengths and assets. Because this can help build people's self-confidence and self-esteem. I think really believe that positive mindset can lead to positive actions. Third, engaging them meaningfully. So going beyond community consultations and these tokenistic forms of participation. Communities are so tired of consultations. They experience a lot of consultation fatigue. So it's really, this is where the fourth point is. The most important point for me is the distribution of power. Shared ownership of projects between communities and development agencies, enabling community members to set their own agendas, to determine their own priorities, and to initiate actions so that the projects will have greater buy-in and have more just and sustainable outcomes.
Yes, thanks so much, Justin. I think those pointers are really important, especially when you look at how to deal with community members, and often some of the solutions we propose are whitewashing and not really deep enough. Now, let's begin to round up. I know most of your questions in the Q&A section have been answered by Annette and Evan, and thank you so much. So we may not even have to go into all those questions. Now, let's round up. And as you respond to this final question, it's going to be the last response from you. Pick on any of the questions in the Q&A box if you want to add that. And we might exceed our time by 5 minutes, if you don't mind. I'm sorry about that. I'm a very bad moderator. Yeah, so I'm going to ask 2 questions. Each of you should feel free to answer only one of them, all right? In addition to any final thoughts you want to have. Now, the first question is, how prepared are stakeholders, like government, international community, non-state actors, civil society, how prepared are they to work together in a just and equitable way to address this apocalyptic event of climate change happening to humanity? So that's the first question. Any of you can respond to it. The second is that, are there any areas and key themes that require further research or policy interventions around relationship building in climate and sustainability? Now, you don't have to respond to both. So in your closing remarks, as I hand over to you, just feel free to respond to any of them and then give us a final thought. Who wants to start? I won't pick. Just jump on and start if you want to. Okay, I probably have to pick now. Do you want to start, Nazir? I think you're on mute. We can start with someone else whilst you sort that out. Evan, do you want to start? Sorry. Okay, I think Nazir is back. Yes.
So I was saying that in terms of the preparedness of stakeholders, to work together in a just and equitable way, I think it is important that we distinguish the stakeholders first, and then to see what possible ways they may have to, put themselves together and ensure that we really achieve our aims. So first of all, we have international laws that govern climate action. And so the international community is very important. And we know that we have international bodies that are, always willing to do their best to ensure that climate action and the climate is protected across all the countries of the world. So we have to first and foremost, see how that international climate or international environment, can be made more accessible to the domestic actors in terms of how best to access the laws, how best to access the international policies, and how available they are. And we know that each and every country is part of this international theater through the Paris Agreement, through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And almost every year, each country is supposed to report on its nationally determined goals and all of that. And so, yes, once the international bodies are available and the international forum is available, we say that let us keep pushing because this is a fight. And so at the international level, it is important that we keep pushing until we achieve some of these goals. Then the next level is at the government level, the local, duty bearers or state level, that it is important that our governments understand that what is expected of them by the international community is important, because some of the principles that are being sponsored by these international instruments have actually crystallized into, if you like, customary principles of international law. And customary principles of international law are technically binding in a way on all nations, except that most of our nations, depending on whether you are a monist state or a dualist state, may require additional work in order to be able to domesticate an international convention or international instrument. And so for a nation like Ghana, for example, where our constitution requires that the fact that we have signed on to an international instrument is not necessarily a binding instrument in Ghana until Parliament, takes the necessary steps to actually domesticate such, an international instrument. So for our governments, it is important for us to begin to domesticate the relevant instruments that will promote climate protection in the various countries. Then again, governments must also recognize that it is important to recognize free, prior, and informed consent. So you have to be able to ensure that you collaborate with the locals, the indigenous people, consult them on all the important issues regarding climate protection, and then put in place the necessary rules that will be resilient enough to help protect the climate.
Great, thank you, Nazir. Do you want to jump in quickly, Annette? Your thoughts?
Sure. I'm just going to keep it very brief. Unfortunately, I have to read my conference. So I think just in terms of some directions for future research policy interventions, I think it's quite important to think global, but act local. That's the one thing I want to say. And I think, I've done a lot of work on illicit economies, as mentioned earlier when you talked about my profile. And there's a lot of learning from illicit economies. For example, during COVID-19, we found in Southern Africa that illicit economies actually bounce back much quicker than licit economies, so the legal sector. So there is some learning from that. We recently published a limited paper on illegal wildlife trade and lessons learned there. So just to keep in mind that we have examples from exogenous shocks on the system. And there are lessons in resilience that we can learn from. And then I suppose it was said many times before, we really, really need to integrate traditional and indigenous knowledge systems in all levels of environmental and climate change policy making. And of course, to always consider both environmental, economic, and not just to environmental, economic, and broader social justice aims when we do work. And then just principally, that policy interventions should aim at empowering local communities. I just leave it at that. Thanks to everyone for listening.
Thank you so much, Annette. So as we run down quickly, Evan, then your final thoughts, and thanks so much, everyone, for coming, Annette. Yeah, thanks. Evan, you want a final thoughts?
Yeah, only on some of the legal concepts. Like there is enough in some of the legal instruments that exist at the global level and possibly in the domestic level too. It is just a question of political will. A lot of the time, as I think Nasir was saying, we don't get that enforcement happening. One of the sort of final points I want to make is about that concept of free, prior, and informed consent, which some of the other speakers have talked to, and that is really quite fundamental in taking community consultation and ticker box type exercises to the next level of actually empowering Indigenous and local people to say no to a particular project. Once you give them that authority and that right, that is next level from come and talk to us about what the impacts are going to be and provide us a level of money. The actual ability to say no really challenges those colonial authoritative power dynamics which have existed for many times, and that therein lies the reason why a lot of developing countries don't want to agree to that. But yeah, anyway, thanks very much for letting me be a part of this.
No, it's amazing to have you all. In fact, so Justin, your final thought. I think we will probably be able to end on the 5 minutes after 11. Yes.
Thanks, Clement. So I'd like to comment on the agendas for future research. First is really investigating intersectionality. So some potential questions for this is, what might an intersectional climate justice agenda look like? How can it already build on existing advances made by several movements? Second, because participation is such an uneven terrain, the role that power and politics play in the context of people's participation in climate responses is another area that needs to be explored. So some of the questions you can ask is, why are some groups able to be more involved and more promote their interests better compared to others? And how much power do development agencies wield over the recipients of their assistance? And the third agenda is for me to explore methodologies and tools for co-production. So how do we increase the spaces in which marginalized groups can effectively address power asymmetries and strengthen their own adaptive capacities? In the literature now, the term negotiated resilience is starting to gain a lot of traction. And this implies that resilience is not just an idealized state. It is a relational process of negotiation between communities and other stakeholders. So what kind of alliances are needed to foster a more just climate response? Thank you. You're on mute, Clement.
Yes, we've just that time, and the more we talk, the more interesting it gets, and the more questions keep coming. But we have to end it at some point. And thanks so much to you all, Annette, Evan, in fact, yeah, who have responded to the text especially, but also to all of you, Justin, Nazir, those who have just left us, for your kindness in sharing your thoughts and very brilliance. And everyone who has joined us today, many, many, many thanks. I know we've exceeded the time by 4 minutes, but that's all because the conversation was getting interesting and intriguing. So I wish all the very best. The recordings may be available for you to access if you want. So we'll get back to you on that. In the meantime, please feel free to register for the other events, the African Week, which is happening throughout this week. And this is the second day panel. So please, thanks so much, and do have a lovely week. And thanks so much, Evan. I'll be in touch, Justin, and everyone later. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.